Welcome to the Seminole campus at St. Pete College. I'm Mark Strickland, the provost of this beautiful facility. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this important program sponsored by SPC's Institute for Strategic Policy Solutions. Thank you all for coming. Obviously, the rain cooperated a little bit, and I hope you've enjoyed your dinner thus far. Let's acknowledge our caterer, Nature's Table, for their food this evening. Additionally, let's also recognize the folks that made this happen. Obviously, the Institute played a significant role, but we've also have a media co-sponsor, which is Tampa Bay Times and WEDU Television. We want to thank them as well. And then also, I want to give a quick shout out to our Student Government Association who sponsor students to attend this program. I want to thank the SGA board. Where are the students this evening? If you're here, stand up. Let's show you some love. They are the reason why we are here, and I hope the semester is off to a good start for them. So now let's get the program underway. I'd like to ask you to welcome the moderator for this evening's program, Mr. David Clement, who's the Executive Director of the Institute for Strategic Policy Solutions. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. And thank you, Provost Strickland. It's my pleasure to add my welcome to you to this program. And yes, to you regulars, we flipped the room. It seemed to make more sense to have the stage at this end than in the middle where it used to be. And it just seems roomier that way. This fall marks the 8th anniversary of the Institute creating and presenting these sorts of public affairs programming for helping you, citizens and students, address head-on the most difficult and contentious issues of the day in a civil setting with the goal of engaging people in discussion in search of solutions to the contentious problems. And if you've been at many of our programs, you know we haven't shirked the most contentious of them. Among them, a previous program on guns. 4 years ago, we addressed gay rights, we addressed medical marijuana legalization, and immigration, and the dreaded FCAT when that was still an issue. But what issue is more contentious than guns, or closer to the core of American culture? Regardless of where you stand on the issue, it has become an inescapable fixture in daily life. For some, it provides security. For others, it induces fear and loathing. And for our nation at large, it figures into what has become a ritual of shock, mourning, hand-wringing, and then resumption of daily life in the new normal of almost weekly mass shootings, large and small. Well, we had one in Jacksonville just 4 days ago, the 4th in 2 years that have taken a total of 73 lives. And except for maybe folks in Jacksonville, the rest of us are going about our business, aren't we? Actually, this is not the first time we've taken up guns, as I said. 4 years ago, after the Sandy Hook massacre, we took up the issue and had an author of a book he had just gone on a tour of the country to learn about gun culture, Dan Baum. I recommend his book. Well, we'll no doubt touch on the culture of guns tonight in our speakers, but I also want to take the discussion in another direction. The title of this program indicates that direction. As I began researching the latest chapter of gun violence, I came across study after study that showed me much of what I thought about guns was wrong, that the gun debate is full of myths, such as if we could just get our arms around the mental health aspect, the problem would greatly shrink, the problem of gun violence and mass shootings. Or if we could just put strict controls on who gets guns, the problem would go away. Or if we could just limit the size of ammo containers, or that it would dissipate at least. But I learned that's not true. So that's why we're here tonight, to try to dispel the myths and get at the facts in the ongoing debate over guns and gun violence. We were doing that with the slides while you were eating and waiting in line for eating, to present some facts about gun violence. I hope you were as shocked at some of those slides, the facts in there, as I was. They were facts, not opinions, not political slogans, not tweets. So I ask our speakers tonight to focus on putting factual information ahead of the myths from their individual perspectives for mental health, law enforcement, historical perspective, and constitutional limitations. When they've had a chance to do that, we'll open to your questions. So let's get started by meeting our first speaker. Dr. John S. Jack Roselle is an associate professor of psychiatry and an adjunct professor of law at the University of Pittsburgh. He is the co-author of an independent study of gun violence titled "The Link Between Mental Illness and Gun Violence, Implications for Social Policy." You can read his full biography in your program. Please welcome Dr. Jack Roselle.
Good evening. David, thank you so much for inviting me to be here with your audience tonight, and thank you to the university as well for having me here to speak with you. So, a little bit about me and why I'm here on this topic. My day job is basically, I'm an emergency psychiatrist. I oversee crisis and emergency mental health services for the greater Pittsburgh region. We do about 150,000 services a year for our region. And we work with all sorts of folks because our portfolio is not just those crisis and emergency services. I also oversee work with juvenile offenders. We do all sorts of different types of interventions. And every day we work with the witnesses of gun violence, the survivors of gun violence. Through my work with juvenile offenders, I've worked with many, many, many youth who've died from gun violence, with many youth who've been offenders and have gone on to murder other people. I've seen gun violence from many angles, clinically, professionally. We even experienced an active shooter event in our own hospital about 5 years ago. And over the years, I've started to look very closely at the science behind this and work about what can we do around the violence and understanding violence, and what can we do to be more effective at managing the violence in our communities and in our clinical settings. And I'm going to share with you some of what we found. Whenever doctors talk with each other, we talk, one of the first things we say is whether or not we take any drug money, because if we're talking about medications, have we taken money from the drug company? I am happy to say I've been drug company free for more than a decade. But I'll also make the point that this is, as David pointed out, firearm injury prevention, gun control is as intensely polarizing and politicized of a topic as we could have come up with. And I've worked very hard to hew true to the science. And what I would suggest to you is that no matter where you stand on this issue, if you talk to me long enough about it, whether you are on one extreme position or the other, sooner or later I'm going to say something that's really going to piss you off. But I'm trying to stay true to the science and come up with practical ideas, practical solutions, because no matter what happens in Washington, D.C. today, or Tallahassee, or Harrisburg, our own state capital, I've still got to go back and I've got to work with these patients and these families and these communities. And so I'm very interested in the practicality. Okay, some core things I want you to understand about violence and mental illness. First, most violence is not attributable to mental illness, okay? Most of the violence that happens in our country and in our communities has nothing to do with psychiatric illness or people living with psychiatric illness. If we snapped our fingers and tonight all the mental illness we have in our country just disappeared, first of all, I'd be tap dancing my way to the unemployment office. And we would still have probably 95, perhaps 99% of the violence that's out there. There's an intersection, and we'll talk about that intersection, but it's very limited. And getting rid of mental illness is helpful and would be a wonderful and positive thing, but it wouldn't really impact the issue of violence. Most people who live with mental illness are not violent. They live their lives amongst us. 1 in 4 people will have psychiatric illness at some point in their lives. 1 in 6 people will meet criteria for a diagnosis this year. That's an awful lot of people, and the vast majority are us. There's nothing remarkable or dangerous or unusual. That we go on, we have our lives. There are doctors and lawyers and judges and elected representatives and everything else. And they live with psychiatric illness, and maybe except for the elected representatives, don't really pose a general harm to other folks. Most people living with mental illness are more likely to be a victim of violence than an offender. That's true for violence in general, and especially for gun violence. Living with a severe psychiatric illness means someone is 5 times as likely to be murdered as someone without a psychiatric illness. Living with a psychiatric illness means someone is 25 times as likely to be a victim of a sex crime as someone without a psychiatric illness. Staggering numbers to think about. But oh yeah, there is an intersection. It's small, it's real, and as a psychiatrist, we damn well better get it right when we encounter that intersection. We have a duty and a responsibility to get it right where there's that intersection. And by the way, one of the nice things about what we do in emergency mental health is we look not just at, okay, this is the person, they meet the specific diagnosis, but this is all the other stuff happening in their life that's driving their needs. The social stressors, school stressors, family issues, financial stuff. We're really good at looking at all that stuff, and luckily, we can help with a lot of that stuff because a lot of that is what drives violence risk. In fact, most of the best predictors of violence risk, things like history of violence, explicit threats, acute psychosocial stressors are very applicable whether or not someone lives with psychiatric illness. So we can use all of this in our toolkit, okay? Good news, we're living in the United States, and for the most part, we're not an especially violent country. This is some data from a few years back, and basically what it says is that amongst economically developed countries, the likelihood of us being assaulted is far lower than most of the other economically developed countries. So good news, we're not an especially violent country. Bad news, we are really deadly when we get violent. Living in the United States, we're about 7 times as likely to die of a firearm suicide. We are about 25 times to die of a firearm homicide as folks in other economically developed countries. And part of the reason is because we have lots and lots of guns. This is recent data, just came out in June from the Small Arms Survey. And by the way, this is a middle of the road estimate. There are other estimates that put it down in about 270 to 300 million range. There are other estimates that put this number at about 600 plus million, okay? And it's not just more guns than the next country. It is more guns than the next 24 countries combined, all right? And by the way, the reason that goes to a total of 25 is because that report only lists the top 25 countries. And I haven't gone through the raw data to figure out what the next 10 or 12 countries might be that would take to add up to the equivalent. And that means that, the fantasy of the far left, the nightmare of the far right, that boom, no guns, we're going to get rid of them, we're going to repeal the Second Amendment. It's just, even if that were to happen, we still have a lot of firearms out there that we as a community, that we as healthcare professionals have to figure out what are we going to do to make sure that we understand the issues around their safety, okay? So, this is some data drawn from research by Adam Lankford, a criminologist at University of Alabama. And when we look at the frequency of mass shooters per 100 million people and the frequency of firearms, we see the United States standing out on our lonesome. When it comes to mass shootings, the United States stands out. Okay, we have a far more of these mass shootings. Now we can have a very long conversation about what that means to be a mass shooting. We'll get to that. Because there's a lot of different ways to define what a mass shooting is. There are probably 10 or 12 really good data sets that are out there from the FBI, from advocacy groups, from different researchers, from Mother Jones Magazine. Actually, they do a very good job of cataloging a lot of these events. The New York Times does this, the NYPD does this. And there's a lot of different ways to define this based on how many people are shot versus how many people are killed, what's the location. And a lot of the data sets, violence that may involve 4 or more victims, which oftentimes would be considered a mass shooting. If it's domestic violence, it won't count. I would suggest it probably should, because we know a large number of these, however you want to define the mass shootings, but a large amount of gun violence in general in our country at its core is domestic violence and violence against women. And so it's a major concern. So we have a lot of different ways to define what a mass shooting is, and we have a lot of different ways within those data sets to define what mental illness is. And when you put all of that together, what happens is you get about a gazillion different answers about how likely is it that the person who committed the latest god-awful atrocity that we're watching on, news channel of choice, whether or not they have mental illness. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means. Because mental illness can have a lot of different meanings, okay? Did they have symptoms currently or in the past? Did they actually meet formal diagnosis? Did a psychiatrist or psychologist sit down and say, this person has post-traumatic stress disorder. This person has panic disorder. This person has major depressive disorder. This person has antisocial personality disorder. Generally, when we look at these studies, a lot of them are saying, oh yes, 50% of these folks had some type of mental illness. What in fact what they're saying is 50% of them had symptoms. And sometimes the report is as simple as the neighbor said they acted strangely. I don't want to know what my neighbor says about me, okay? He may have some opinions, I may have some opinions, but we're good friends, but I'm sure we have some different opinions. But if I called up the insurance company and said, hey, I want to admit a patient, and I'm basing my diagnosis because the neighbor said they acted strangely, it's not what we consider a scientifically valid diagnosis. It's not something we take seriously. Most importantly, I think for myself is, if I saw this person in the ER, would I say this is a person who has a clear diagnosis that I can treat, that I can do something about? Because when society says, another mentally ill person did blank, which is almost always not actually a mentally ill person, but anyhow, I think what they're saying is psychiatrists, mental health professionals, wouldn't you have done something if you could have just had the chance to work with this person? And believe me, there's a part of me that wishes most of these people, all these people had psychiatric illness, because then I'd feel like I could actually get my hands on something and do something with it. But the reality just doesn't support that, because our best data says maybe 25% of the people who are identified as engaging have a clear identified prior psychiatric diagnosis. Perhaps only 5% of these would have met any of the formal criteria that would have said they aren't allowed to have a gun in the future. Something like an involuntary hospitalization found, not competent to stand trials, something like that. A higher level, court identification, guilty but mentally ill, something like that. Vanishingly rare in these folks. And in fact, of the people who survive these offenses, who go on to stand trial, you'll find very few of them are found not competent to stand trial. There certainly are exceptions. Very few of them are considered what we call JBMI, which is a type of defense, or not guilty by reason of insanity. It happens, but it's vanishingly rare. So in our formal legal definitions of this is impairing mental illness, generally the courts don't agree that these people have impairing mental illness. All right, this is some recent data from the CDC, which shows that over the past 2 years, we've actually seen a bump in firearm homicides, whereas other types of homicides have remained steady. And that's notable because by and large, over the past 30 years, from sort of the mid-'80s until recently, we've had a significant dip in our overall homicide rate in the country. In 2014, we were down to 4.5 homicides per 100,000. It bumped up a little bit in 2015 and 2016. We think 2017, we don't have the final data yet, but we think it's going to be down to maybe 5.2. But note just this very simple trend. We have a lot less murders in the United States than we did 30 years ago. This is important, okay? Because this is a data set looking at mass shootings from the mid-1980s until recently. And here, it's going in the other direction. We have a lot more mass shootings. This is based on the Mother Jones data set analyzed by The Economist, by the way. So whereas homicides in general have gone down, these have gone up, okay? Gun Violence Archive is a relatively decent non-biased data source. And overall, year to date, so from January 1st, 38,000 incidents, about 9,500 deaths, which are accidents or homicides. By the way, for every firearm homicide, we have 2 firearm suicides in our country. The most likely person to, for every gun that gets brought home for self-defense, the most likely person that will shoot and kill will be someone in that household. So it's a very significant issue. And maybe 200 or so mass shooting incidents. Again, lots of different ways to define what a mass shooting is, but broadly, 1% or less of all of our homicides are tied into these. So yes, it would be really nice to have some public policy intervention that would get rid of these awful events. But if we leave the other 99% of homicides, if we leave the twice as many suicides untouched, then we're wasting our public health efforts. All right. I like me some science, and unfortunately the science is tricky on this. It's really hard to track guns, to know where guns go. We have a little bit of basic data that says, you know, in a state like Pennsylvania, where I live, where we have relatively permissive gun laws, a lot of our guns end up in our neighboring states that might have more restrictive gun laws. For lots of different reasons, but it's really tricky for our law enforcement colleagues to be able to track down and figure out when they arrest that person, when they find the abandoned gun, where did it come from, how did it get there? It's a very slow process. We don't have standardized data sets on how many people are injured, shot, or killed with firearms every year. We don't have any way to figure out, you know, what are the suicides, what are the homicides. We know lots of accidental shootings or negligent discharges, as the firearm owners will say, aren't actually reported because if you're not injured that badly, you don't want to go to the ER and say, hey, I kind of shot myself in the butt when I sat on my gun. You know, and so we know we missed somebody. And it's really tough to do research. A lot of you've probably heard about the Dickey Amendment, which basically told the CDC don't do research that might lead to gun control. The NIH also provides very little research funding. And you know, unlike pharmaceutical research, where there's some very large drug companies happy to fund research on their drugs, there's not a lot of folks out there willing to fund research on firearm injury prevention. Okay. Then we have the news media and the journalism issue, because you know, we always have this immediate cycle right after, again, tragic event blank. Where we have those initial hours filled by, you know, the talking heads on the news before we get the formal stand-up report from, you know, law enforcement, that first crisis briefing. And there's a couple problems. We know that people who engage in mass shootings look at the news coverage, at the Wikipedia, at the online reports of these folks and say, this person used techniques A, B, and C. A and B worked really well, C didn't, so I'm going to modify C, but I'm going to adapt those others, and I'm going to do that. We know this because the ones who survived tell us this, or they put it in their writings or in their postings, or it's very clear that they've mimicked and learned from the techniques of these other folks. We know it glamorizes that. We know that in the 2 weeks after a mass shooting, we're more likely to see another mass shooting in our country. Someone turns on TV, and it's not that they go from 0 to 100 and say, yes, I wasn't going to do this at all, but now I'm watching, you know, CNN, yes, now I'm going to do it. But they were maybe 75% of the way there and say, that guy's getting all the attention. I want that attention. I can do better. I can, as violent as it sounds, I can score higher. And they think of it in that level, okay? It's misleading. Because they're up there saying, oh, it's mental illness, it's video games, it's doors, it's all the stuff that doesn't actually drive the danger or the risk. And our policymakers in our state capitals and the federal government listen to these talking heads on TV, and then we get some of these policies that aren't so great. It's traumatizing to people. It's desensitizing, and it's potently stigmatizing. We have research from Australia and New Zealand that says that stigma around mental illness in Australia and New Zealand, the other side of the world, is driven by media coverage in the United States of these types of events where mental illness is immediately pointed at as the cause. Because remember, when we say 1 in 4 of these folks who engage in these mass shootings might have a mental illness, 1 in 4 folks in this room probably has a mental illness or will have a mental illness at some point in their life. It's not a surprising number to see. By the way, very good reporting journalism best practices put out by the Poynter Institute, available at reportingonmassshootings.org. Anyone from Poynter in the room? No, okay. Reportingonmassshootings.org. All right. Video games, a popular target after these. Oh my gosh, it was the violent video games. This is from the Washington Post from about a year ago, and it looks at per capita spending on video games versus gun-related murders, and again, the United States seems to stand out significantly there. Of note, some of the folks who were most sort of notoriously involved in violent video games, the offender in Newtown, Connecticut, and you may have noticed I don't use the offenders' names out of respect for them, for the deceased, but the offender in Newtown who said, oh my gosh, he was a video game player. Does anyone know the video game that he played the most? Dance Dance Revolution. I don't know what that means or what to do with that. There's a lot of research about violent video games and violent behavior, and by and large what it says is that there's probably no meaningful connection between playing violent video games and real-world violence, although there may be some kind of a proxy effect that people who are incredibly competitive happen to like video games where they can be very competitive, and that's the same type of personality and disposition that may lend someone to be more likely to engage in violence in other settings. Oftentimes we hear this idea of if we just had more guns, we'd have fewer of these events because there'd be good guys with guns around to stop that from happening. Well, with guns in the community means the risk of negligent discharges and accidental injuries. This is research from Science just from late last fall, And with the surge of almost 1 million new purchases of firearms, that sharp black line spike right after Newtown, Connecticut, what happened were there were actually 60 additional deaths of children and 20 additional accidental deaths of adults, likely related to that surge in new purchases. People in gun sales talk about Black Friday right after Thanksgiving is this great sales day. In emergency departments, we talk about Bloody Saturday when they bring the guns home and they aren't comfortable with the guns yet and something horrible and accidental happens. Okay. Safe ownership and use of firearms. This is from our TSA colleagues. These are people coming through security checkpoints. I went through a couple yesterday. And we have had a surge over the past decade of people being intercepted with firearms at these checkpoints. Generally people who are concealed carry. 84% of these firearms are loaded. A third of them had a round chambered. So these are generally people carrying concealed with them on their body, forgetting that they have a loaded weapon as they walk into a very obvious security checkpoint. I find that concerning. I find it even more concerning after I give these talks and someone comes and says, actually, I did that once and they didn't catch me, which we know also happens. What we know by and large with this whole idea, of good guys with guns, there's a very small subset of active shooter events that are stopped by quote unquote good guys and good gals with guns. Predominantly, the majority of those good guys and good gals are off-duty law enforcement or former law enforcement or active service duty service members at home or veterans or people with very high skill sets. But that accounts for perhaps a few % of active shooter events. So yeah, it's out there, it happens, but it's not a great solution because there's obviously a huge risk of accidental injury, risk of suicide, and so many other things as well. There's an idea out there that if we were to get rid of assault-style weapons, again, variously defined in various laws, we would have a big impact. We would have a small impact on mass shootings. The total death rates, the total injuries in mass shootings would go down. About a quarter of the weapons used in mass shootings are these types of weapons. And even though you can put a high-capacity magazine in a semi-automatic handgun, the round, for those of you who are not firearms people, the power of that round, the kinetic energy of the round coming out of a handgun is almost universally far less. It just has less momentum than what comes out of a rifle. So it would make a difference, but a very small difference. And again, we have 5 to 10 million of these types of weapons already out in the community legally. And so there would be no quick solution to get rid of those. And if we were to restrict sales on new ones, prices would go up, economics would come into play, but there you go. Stand your ground laws. Public health experts around the country are really interested in you guys here in Florida with stand your ground laws. Implementation of Florida's stand your ground self-defense law was associated with a significant increase in homicides by firearm, but no changes in suicide or suicide by firearm. That's the Journal of the American Medical Association. Just this year, implementation of stand your ground laws in urban counties led to a 5 to 10% increase in homicide. The RAND Corporation did a major study on firearm policy in the past 6 months. And they said there's moderate evidence that stand your ground increases homicides and no evidence that stand your ground decreases other violent crime. New research that came out today for Florida actually specifically says that it has been associated with increased homicide in counties that are more affluent, more homogeneously white, and had a lower baseline homicide rate than in other counties. Make of that what you will, but it's again, public health folks around the country are very interested in stand your ground and are not seeing the effects that people had hoped it might have. Now, here are some things that we do have good evidence that are effective ways to limit gun violence, and that we do have good evidence that not just people support in general, but gun owners and non-gun owners alike support this. This came out of the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health just a few months ago. Universal background checks before purchase of a firearm, okay? Seems common sense. 80 to 90% of gun owners support this, 90+% of non-gun owners support this. So if I want to buy a gun in Pennsylvania, I can buy any long weapon, whether it is a single action rifle, whether it is an AR-15 with high capacity rounds. I can buy that cash money and I can meet someone in a parking lot to do it with no background check. No one to say, are you a nice person? Are you competent with a firearm? Nothing else like that. More than half the states allow some kind of private transfer of firearms. Allowing the ATF to ding bad dealers, right? So they're unreliable owners, they're also unreliable dealers. By the way, a lot of dealers who get tied up and have problems with straw purchases are actually the same dealers who are really interested in learning more about how to screen their customers and be really effective. I have friends who are gun dealers, and I don't know any of them who want a visit from the sheriff or a call from the medical examiner or God forbid, to turn on the evening news and say, I remember that one. They want to do right by their customers and their communities. Permitting, okay? So for concealed carry, again in Pennsylvania, I can get a concealed carry permit for $30, a clean background check, and 2 people to vouch that I'm not a total asshole. That might be a challenge. But nothing to say I have decent eyesight, nothing to say I don't have a tremor, nothing to say that I'm remotely competent with a firearm. Require states to report people to the national background system when they're involuntarily committed or have some other disqualifying event, like a protection from abuse order or something like that. A lot of states are not reporting this data to the background check, to the national system, okay? Removal of firearms from a person subject to a domestic violence temporary restraining order. Many states don't do that, or they'll say, oh, you have to hand in the guns, or you aren't allowed to have guns, but they won't affirmatively go and remove them. Allowing families to petition for temporary removal of firearms. The red flag law, the gun violence restraining order, which I think you've recently passed here, which a handful of states have, which we do have very good evidence can decrease suicides. We're not quite as sure about violence, but we at least have some good published research that says it decreases suicides. And I know clinically I can think of a number of cases where it could have been very helpful. All right, video here, this is actually from one of the Newtown Mothers groups.
I'm here at the scene of tomorrow's shooting, where a 15-year-old will kill 4 children, 2 adults, and then turn the gun on himself.
When the shooting starts happening tomorrow, first I'll probably just think it's firecrackers or a car backfiring or something.
He told some of us that his dad kept the gun in his closet, and he always talked about using it on, you know, the people that bullied him. Tomorrow I'll probably say that I wish I told someone.
You know, after the shooting, we're gonna feel pretty bad about picking on him, but until then, we'll probably just keep doing it because he's pretty weird.
Tomorrow I'll probably point out that something has seemed off with him since the beginning of the school year.
And I'm now joined by the officers who will be the first responders tomorrow. What additional details can you share with us?
Well, someone is expected to tell us after the shooting that the shooter has been posting on social media about doing this for weeks.
So how will you explain the shooting to your daughter?
Actually, I won't get to explain it to her because she won't make it.
This is Christine Lynn, reporting from the scene of another shooting we'll say we never saw coming.
In a Secret Service study of school shootings over 25 years, only 15% of the offenders had an identified psychiatric illness. 80% had warned someone. Not had warning signs or unusual behavior, but had specifically said, I'm going to do something really bad. And they made specific warnings either to the targets or to other people, and people knew about this and did not act. If you see something, if you hear something, say something. If someone comes to you with something, act on it. Contact the law enforcement professionals. One of the things we say a lot in the field of threat assessment is you got to collect the dots before you can connect the dots. We've got to gather the information. We've got to put it together. There are systematic approaches. We call it behavioral-based threat assessment, where we look at acts of furtherance towards an act of violence that we find to be very effective in decreasing violent behavior, including these types of targeted attacks. In fact, Representative Bruce Babin from Texas has introduced a resolution in the Federal House of Representatives 6664, the TAPS Act, to promote the development of threat assessment programs across the country and provide funding for that as well. That's it. We have a bunch of other wonderful speakers. I think we're taking questions at the end. I go to the end? Yep. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Roselle, and we'll get back to you when all the speakers have spoken. Next, we'd like to add a historical context to the gun issue. To give us that, I've called on the well-known and much-loved Professor Emeritus of History at USF St. Petersburg, Dr. Gary Mormino. As the bio in your program indicates, he taught at USF for 36 years and has won numerous awards for his books, especially the landmark book, Land of Sunshine, State of Dreams, A Social History of Modern Florida. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Dr. Gary Mormino.
Thank you for coming tonight. I'm finishing a book on Florida from 2000 to the present, and in many ways, guns and violence kind of provide bookends to this period. You just look at the date, the names: Trayvon Martin, Orlando Pulse, Parkland. The title of the chapter that I'm working on now is "The Rise of the Gunshine State," about Florida. But I'm going to introduce it in a very different way to see if this works or not. But question: what is the most revolutionary act in the history of Florida? What event or series of events marked a before and after moment, not only for a spit of land called Florida, but for the modern world? Discuss among yourselves, and we'll come back in a little while after dessert. So on April the 2nd, 1513, a voyage of exploration led by Juan Ponce de Leon sighted land somewhere between Daytona Beach and Cape Canaveral. The expedition included 3 ships and 200 men. The first-person narratives and accounts are lost. So I'm going to give you 2 competing scripts, both taken from my Florida history classes, of what might have happened. The first script deals with the encounter. The Spanish come to shore, priests, officials, warriors, and the AIS Indians, AIS Indians of that area, confronted them, and both sides exchanged foods. It's the beginning of what historians call the Columbian Exchange. No Spaniard had ever eaten New World corn. No American native had ever had wheaten bread. And for all purposes, modernization began in 1513. Spaniards also brought pathogens and germs, but the gathering ignited what a historian called the Columbian Exchange. No Florida native had ever tasted Castilian wheaten bread, Valencian rice, Seville oranges, olives from La Mancha, Menorcan turkeys, Andalusian beef. No Spaniard had sampled wild turkey, potatoes, tomatoes, maize, or chili peppers. The second script, the history of the New World would be incomplete without the gun. The Spaniards come ashore, and they're bringing, in effect, the AK-47 or the AK-15 of 1513. The arquebus, named for a Dutch long rifle, wildly inaccurate, but it was the most modern gun of the period. And when fired en masse, it provided a terrifying psychological weapon. And the first gun death in America may well have taken place at that moment. We don't know, but we know by the end of the voyage, gun deaths had taken place. So the beginning of violence in the New World comes from that first moment in 1513. You cannot separate guns from the history of Florida. Florida was a southern state, a frontier. In fact, by the late 19th century, Florida remained the only frontier east of the Mississippi. And guns and frontiers go together. If you wanted a single moment where this is revealed, in 1542, the Second Seminole War was over. This is the biggest of the wars for the Seminole Wars. And the U.S. Congress sponsors what's called the Armed Occupation Act. And the key word is Armed Occupation Act. It's the first Homestead Act in American history, offering heads of the family 160 acres of land. If you come to Florida, cultivate the land, build a house, and bring your weapon to put down a future Seminole uprising. 19th century Florida, 20th century Florida, every study would indicate as a southern state, Florida and the South were the most violent regions in the country. Complicated reasons for this, obviously availability of weapons, what once would have been simple gunfire, knuckle fights now end in deaths, but also the racial situation in Florida, slavery, the frontier, all of these factors support the idea of Florida and the South as a violent state in a violent region. After the Civil War ended, and this is true of all wars in America, when the war is over, you have a huge surplus of firearms. Firearms that are widely distributed to the population. They're cheap. And one historian has actually argued, it's a very controversial point, that prior to the Civil War, guns were so expensive, you really didn't have a lot of guns. But after the Civil War, guns are cheap, they're mass-produced. The very names, Colt 45, Remington rifles, these become industrial factories producing guns by the millions in America. To fast forward this, the key decade may be in understanding gun violence in America, maybe the 1960s. Whereas in Europe, gun deaths went down dramatically after World War II. In part, that was also because you didn't have the population boom in Europe after World War II. But a frightening level of violence ignited in the 1960s. And Americans get afraid. If there's one group, if you wanted a poster child for getting a gun in the 1960s, it would have been the Black Panthers. There's a famous story. Ronald Reagan is appearing at a picnic in Sacramento, outside the State House in Sacramento. And Bobby Seale and 30 Black Panthers arrive, armed and loaded, which was legal at the time, by the way. And Reagan actually is a gun rights opponent at this time. The quotes, Ronald Reagan in 1967 contended that guns were, quote, a ridiculous way to solve problems that have to be solved among people of goodwill. And that ending, goodwill, may be the key word. Goodwill seems to be in drastic shortage. The pendulum certainly swung back in the 1960s as gun deaths escalated, and you had, in some ways, the last significant gun control legislation, the Gun Control Act of 1968, among others. In Florida, interesting way of wrapping this up, hurricanes and guns have a special relationship in Florida. The hurricane of 1561 smashed the De Luna colony on Pensacola Bay and allowed St. Augustine to become the oldest continuously settled city in America. And 6 years later, the hurricane at Pensacola Bay wiped out the French colony, allowing the Spanish to succeed in America. In 2005, state legislatures in Tallahassee were cobbling together a bill that would dramatically strengthen citizens' rights of self-defense. They needed a dramatic event and a perfect example to build their case. And it came, the name was James Workman, and the place was Pensacola Bay. After the Hurricane Ivan hit Pensacola Bay, a lot of workers from the South poured in to take care of jobs. And James Workman was 77, retired, and he's confronted with an intruder in his trailer, and he shoots the intruder. And this is the case for Stand Your Ground in Florida. So guns in Florida, guns in the South, guns in America, a stunning chapter in American history. I'm looking forward to your questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Mormino. Now it's time to hear a perspective from law enforcement. And for that, I call upon Pinellas County's own Sheriff, Bob Gualtieri.
So I kind of pick up where Dr. Mormino left off. There is really a nexus between hurricanes and guns in Florida. And one of the things more recently that the Florida legislature did a couple years ago was created a provision in Florida law that if there's an evacuation order during a hurricane, is that anybody can carry a concealed firearm without a permit while they're under that emergency evacuation order from the place of their home to the place they're going. So, you know, it didn't end, and they continue to find that nexus between guns and hurricanes in Florida. But anyway, what I think I want to talk about is just kind of the basic landscape, and especially talk about the nexus and the intersection between guns and mental health from our perspective. One of the things I want to tell you is that there's a big misconception, and I think one of the reasons in Florida there's a big misconception about this is a lot of people from Florida, from someplace else, especially the Northeast, is that, and it was touched upon in the doctor's presentation a little bit, but when somebody buys a gun, and they buy their gun from an FFL, or a federally licensed firearms dealer, is that there is a record of that sale because the FFL is required to report who they sold that gun to. But once they sell that gun, is that unless it is sold again by a licensed dealer, is that there's no record of that. So if you go to a gun store and you buy a gun, and then on the street you sell it to me, and I sell it to you, and I sell it to him, is that when that gun, if that gun is used in a crime, is that we have no way of telling who has that gun beyond the person that was sold to by an FFL. And in fact, in Florida, another big misconception is that we have some knowledge of who gun owners are. The Florida legislature passed a law that actually prohibits, it bans, it's illegal for governmental agencies, for law enforcement agencies to keep any lists at all whatsoever of any gun owners or guns that are owned by people. So being able to make that determination is very difficult, and in some cases it is impossible, because when the guns are sold during private sales, there's absolutely no record of it. Getting to the issue of background checks. So again, big misconceptions and breaking the myths, is that most people, when they hear the term background check, think that there is some vetting, that there is some check that's done that is ensuring or assuring that the person who that gun dealer is selling the gun to doesn't have problems, doesn't have issues, and there's no reason to believe that that person shouldn't possess a gun. Well, that's erroneous. That's just flat out not true. Because when we throw this term around about background checks, the only thing is done is really a disqualification check. Because if you go into the local gun store and say you want to buy a gun, what they're going to check is to see if you have committed a crime, a felony offense, or some misdemeanor offenses that are disqualifying crimes that you've been convicted of, or some limited crimes that you may have been arrested for that are still pending. The other thing they're going to check for, which gets into this whole broad area the doctor was talking about, and David kind of alluded to a little bit, is this whole thing about mental health. Is that people think that here in Florida, and what we call it here in Florida, they call it something different everywhere else, is the involuntary commitment statute, where we take people into custody. We call it the Baker Act here in Florida. And people think that if you have been Baker Acted, that you've been taken into custody for involuntary mental health examination, that that's going to disqualify you from purchasing a gun. That is absolutely not true. Is that the only way you're disqualified is if you have an adjudication for one of those crimes, you've been arrested and the case is pending for certain crimes, or a judge has involuntarily committed you. You could be Baker Acted 5 times in the last week. You can have the cops at your house 5 times in the last week for domestic violence related issues, having threatened your family, threatened your wife, threatened your husband or whoever, and go out tonight and buy a gun. You're not prohibited from buying a gun. You're only prohibited from buying a gun is if you meet that limited criteria of an adjudication. So there are roughly in the state of Florida every year just under 200,000 Baker Acts annually. There are about 12,000 Baker Acts involuntary commitments for mental health reasons here in Pinellas County. And not a single one of those people are ever disqualified from purchasing a gun for that reason. So the Baker Act doesn't disqualify you. The background check notion, I don't think is really a proper term for it, because it doesn't tell you whether somebody at that moment really is somebody that should be buying that gun. So if you are in a domestic argument last night with a spouse, and you say to that spouse, I'm going to kill you, you can go out today and buy a gun, and nobody's checking to see whether there's a police report that says you were going to kill your spouse last night. So we're not checking law enforcement databases. We're not checking available indices. We're not vetting that person to see if there's something that is known to somebody about whether that person should be buying that gun. So again, I really think that the notion that we're doing background checks is a myth. We're doing disqualification checks, and unless it meets that limited criteria, you can buy a gun. So here in Pinellas County is one of the few counties in the state of Florida that has an ordinance that does require whatever it is, they call them background checks, for private sales at gun shows. So this is what you hear about the gun show loophole, because in, let's say, Orange County, they don't have an ordinance, is that if you go to a gun dealer, a gun store, they're going to do a background check, and they're going to have a record of that sale. But if somebody rents a hall, rents the convention center, and has a whole bunch of people there with tables, and they're all in there all weekend long selling their guns, is that they're just private sales from one individual to another, and they don't have to be federally licensed firearm dealers to do that, and there's no requirement of any check whatsoever. But here in Pinellas County, Hillsborough County, a couple, there's only about a handful, 4 or 5 counties that actually have closed the gun show loophole and do require those checks at those gun shows, but it's only where guns are sold at a public place. So it still doesn't prevent somebody from buying guns from their next door neighbor, buying guns from somebody on the street, or walking down Central Avenue in St. Petersburg and saying, here's $100, give me the gun, and there's no record of it, it's perfectly legal, and the seller doesn't have to check at all to see if that person's a convicted felon or a dope dealer or anybody else that probably shouldn't have that gun. So that's kind of a brief overview of the situation from our perspective. I'll leave you with this and provoke some thought here, on this. And what you heard is that generally speaking, broad with active shooter or active assailant situations, that most of them are not stopped by people with a gun, with a good guy with a gun. But let me share this with you: is that the governor appointed me this year last few months to chair the commission that's investigating the Marjory Stoneman Douglas tragedy at Parkland. And we're looking very closely at K through 12 shootings. And that is true as it relates to the broad mass shooting situation, but really not true as it relates to K through 12 active assailant situations. In fact, the majority of those, and we looked at them all for the last 20 years, and a high percentage of those are stopped by teachers, principals, custodians, and staff on campus. The majority of those are stopped by non-law enforcement personnel, because the majority of those shootings begin and end within about 3 minutes. The majority of those shootings occur by somebody with access, a current student, a former student. So while we really have to build the core and build the infrastructure and do a lot better at behavioral threat assessments, at site hardening and other things, is that until we get that built out, and there's about 4,000 schools in the state of Florida, and we're not going to do this overnight to make it better, is that I suggest to you is that we have to have somebody there in that last line of defense, which in the immediate future becomes the first line of defense, because the cops can't be everywhere all the time. And we can't have multiple law enforcement officers in these schools, and some of these are sprawling campuses. Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School has 2,300 students, and it's a 45-acre campus with 16 buildings. One cop on that campus is a check the box. It's a feel good. That cop can't be everywhere all the time. So I'm going to end with this. Think about this. Right now we say, and a whole bunch of people say, that we shouldn't arm principals, we shouldn't arm teachers, we shouldn't arm custodians, we shouldn't have any armed personnel on these campuses other than a law enforcement officer, recognizing that these incidents are over in 3 minutes, These are sprawling campuses, so think about this. And I have had the unfortunate, I guess, responsibility to view the video from inside that school and watch the killings of those kids. And I can tell you this, is that when the killer went into that school, and he was in that school for a total of 6 minutes, he shot and killed 34 people, killed 17, shot 17, 34 people. 3 minutes of that 6 minutes, he was in the third floor teacher's lounge trying to break open the windows so he could snipe out and from a sniper position kill all the kids in the courtyard. So 3 minutes he was in that lounge. The remaining 3 minutes he was on the first floor, the second floor, and the third floor. 5 times when he's in the building during the 3 minutes when he was shooting, 5 times his gun was empty. 5 times his gun was empty because he had ripped the magazine out of it and he was reloading that gun. There were school personnel who were there that have had guns on the first floor. When he emptied that gun and that gun was empty, could have shot and killed him. But there was nobody there to take effective action. So he was able to continue his rampage on the first floor, move to the second floor, move to the third floor. His gun was empty 5 times. So should we have somebody there that could take that effective action? So I'll leave you with that.
Thank you, Sheriff. Some pretty, to me, upsetting statistics there and some information. Now, next, let's look at the constitutional aspect. As we often say, if certainly the gun control side says if we could just control the guns, we could eliminate a lot of the violence. To put that constitutional perspective, I asked David Cronenfeld, a Tampa attorney with experience in Second Amendment case, to bring us that background. Mr. Cronenfeld.
Thank you, David. It's good to be with you all tonight. As David shared, I am David Cronenfeld. I work over in Tampa for Cottney Construction Law. I'm actually a corporate and mergers and acquisitions attorney, and I do estate planning as well. And the estate planning aspect is where I deal with a lot of firearms and Second Amendment issues. Just a couple housekeeping things. First of all, my remarks are personal to me and not to the firm, don't reflect necessarily the viewpoints of the firm, nor should anything I say be taken as legal advice, and nor do any of my remarks constitute an attorney-client relationship with any of you. So with that out of the way, we'll go to the Second Amendment. David asked me just to give kind of a historical perspective just in the context of the Second Amendment and when it was enacted, as well as some congressional limitations that have been passed in the intervening years and some jurisprudence surrounding that. So here, the Second Amendment, it states, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And I know the right and the left love to tangle over what a militia is, what arms are. I'm not here to address that. I'm here to discuss the context of this passage. So I figured probably the easiest way to address that would be to present to you some quotes from the Founding Fathers who were either at the Constitutional Convention or wrote some of the literature interpreting the Constitution as it was first passed. So here is a extremely long quote. Don't worry, I'm not going to bore you with reading the whole thing. John Jay, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton wrote the Federalist Papers during the intense debate over the Constitution and whether it would actually be enacted. And here we have Federalist number 46, and if you look at the bolded print, they state, besides the advantage of being armed, which the Americans possess over the people of almost every other nation, the existence of subordinate governments, that would be the states, to which the people are attached and by which the militia officers are appointed, forms a barrier against the enterprises of ambition, more insurmountable than any which a simple government of any form can admit of. So here we have two, I think, statements that need to be highlighted. First, the Federalist authors are admitting that the American people are armed, that they have arms in their possession as private citizens. And second, that there is a militia of some sorts. Again, don't want to delve into the definition of that. And then third, the Second Amendment was not here necessarily for hunting, self-defense, et cetera. It was instead implemented as to make sure that if the federal government usurped its powers, that there was a check on that federal government. So we'll go to Joseph Story. He was a justice in the Supreme Court from 1811 to 1845, and he actually wrote a commentary on the Constitution in 1833 when he was a sitting justice. And Justice Story states, "The right of the citizens to keep and bear arms has justly been considered as the palladium of the liberties of a republic, since it offers a strong moral check against the usurpation and arbitrary power of rulers, and will generally, even if these are successful in the first instance, enable the people to resist and triumph over them." So again, further evidence of the Second Amendment being this check on the usurpation of power by the federal government. Another one by Richard Henry Lee, who had fought in the Revolution. Quote, "A militia, when properly formed, are in fact the people themselves." So here we have maybe an argument about what the militia is. "And include all men," and I would argue today, women, "capable of bearing arms. To preserve liberty, it is essential that the whole body of people always possess arms. The mind that aims at a select militia must be influenced by a truly anti-republican principle." We're going to, in the interest of time, we're just going to skip over this one by Noah Webster, and we'll go to one by Thomas Jefferson, where he's quoting actually an 18th century criminologist. Jefferson says, "The laws that forbid the carrying of arms are laws of such a nature. They disarm only those who are neither inclined nor determined to commit crimes. Such laws make things worse for the assaulted and better for the assailants. They serve rather to encourage than to prevent homicides. For an unarmed man may be attacked with greater confidence than an armed man." Again, these are just to provide context for the Second Amendment. I'm not here to make any arguments for or against any aspect of gun control, but simply to provide a historical context. So let's skip now to congressional limitations on firearms ownership. And I've highlighted three of what I think are some of the most important regulations that Congress has passed affecting firearms ownership. So the first came in 1934. It's called the National Firearms Act, and it instituted a $200 tax on the transfer of suppressors, which are sometimes called silencers, machine guns, short-barreled rifles and shotguns, destructive devices, and other classes of firearms. They're often called any other weapon, AOW. And all of those firearms must be registered with the NFA registry, which is actually today administered by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. And that $200 tax is in 1934 dollars and has actually never been updated for inflation. So I'd hate to see that number. Second, we had the Gun Control Act of 1968, which was discussed earlier here. And the big thing that I want to highlight in that act was that it actually regulated the interstate commerce of firearms. So prior to that, you could actually mail order a firearm from, say, Colt in Connecticut, and it would be shipped right to your door. And so this prevented that and implemented some of the checks in place with federal firearms licensees, et cetera, that we see today. And then finally, and this is kind of tangential, but it's a little important in the current debate, especially with machine guns and bump stocks and things like that. But the Firearms Owners Protection Act of 1986 had an amendment attached to it. It's often called the Hughes Amendment. And the Hughes Amendment prohibited the manufacture of new machine guns, except in extremely limited circumstances, which are really outside the purview of this conversation. And that effectively limited the number of machine guns to a very specific number. And they'd had to have been registered prior to a certain date. And so today, the NFA registry, I believe, has around 250,000. There's different numbers that float out there. I've seen that one the most often. Jack, I don't know if you may have seen a different number. Okay. So those are, there was also the assault weapons ban. But again, that has lapsed, so I really just decided not to touch on that. So let's shift now to firearms jurisprudence. And I limited myself to Supreme Court cases. There's a lot of state court cases. There's a lot of circuit court cases that address specific pieces of firearms legislation and regulation. But I tried to stick to just what encompasses all 50 states and the territories of the U.S. So the first one I picked was probably the worst case to come out of the Supreme Court ever, and that was Dred Scott in 1857. And it denied Dred Scott the protection of the Bill of Rights. And I bolded a couple pieces that I wanted to highlight here. So it says, this is Justice Taney's majority opinion, for if they, referring to escaped slaves and African Americans, were so received and entitled to the privileges and immunities of citizens, and then it goes on to state, it would give to persons of the Negro race who are recognized as citizens in any one state of the Union the right to, and it enumerates out multiple rights. And interestingly enough, the final right is, and to keep and carry arms wherever they went. So I would say here, the Supreme Court in 1857 is identifying the Second Amendment as an individual right, free of the militia component. And so we skip ahead to 1939, which if you refer back to a couple slides, we talked about the National Firearms Act. So this was actually a case that was litigating that National Firearms Act. Miller sued the U.S., or rather the U.S. sued Miller, over ownership of a short-barreled shotgun. And the Supreme Court ruled that it didn't have a reasonable relationship to service in a militia to have constitutional protections under the Second Amendment, and thus the National Firearms Act was indeed constitutional. And so here is one of the first references we see to the militia component in Supreme Court jurisprudence on the Second Amendment. So then fast forward to 2008, which it's crazy that this case was actually decided 10 years ago, but Heller versus District of Columbia, and this was a landmark case because it ruled that ownership of firearms is an individual right and not connected to militia service. But many gun advocates actually argued that it didn't go far enough because it only guaranteed that right for traditionally lawful purposes, which put items that were covered under the National Firearms Act and other restrictions outside of the protections of the Second Amendment. And so many originalists have argued that that was it was not a broad enough ruling. And so then skip ahead 2 years to McDonald versus City of Chicago, which Heller did not incorporate the Second Amendment, which is basically where the amendment gets applied to state and local authorities. And that's what we saw in McDonald and then also Catano, that the Second Amendment was incorporated against state and local governments, and that also the Second Amendment applies to all bearable arms. And we're still seeing kind of what that is going to look like. I do think if Kavanaugh is appointed, and especially if there's another justice appointed in this administration, we might see some interesting test cases come out. That's just my opinion. I don't know, and I don't know what might come through. One piece of legislation in particular that was getting a lot of ground in the last couple years, however, the Pulse and Las Vegas and Parkland kind of put the brakes on it, is the Hearing Protection Act, which would remove silencers or suppressors from the purview of the National Firearms Act, and instead require those to simply be transferred just as a normal firearm, such as a long gun or a handgun would be, and not subject to the tax and not subject to the additional regulatory transfer requirements that go along with that the ATF has enacted, 41F and other things. So then I want to conclude with, these are kind of restrictions that the court, the Supreme Court that is, have upheld or have allowed. One is age. So federal law for handguns ownership is 21 and long guns is 18. Obviously, some states have further restriction on that. That was indeed something that was being discussed after the Parkland shooting here. Criminals, so as Sheriff Gualtieri discussed, criminals and who have committed felonies, and some misdemeanors are prohibited from firearms ownership. However, that does require, as he discussed, the entry of that data into the NICS database, which we are finding that is often not done in addition to substance abuse, mental capacity, and illness. Those are all things that are allowable. It's not necessarily that they're done. It's that the ATF can ask on those things on their transfer forms. Concealed carry, the Supreme Court has allowed that certain states can regulate differently. Ammunition and magazine limitations, including taxes on various things, waiting periods, and then of course U.S. citizenship. So that's a very, very brief overview of the kind of the legal context and jurisprudence surrounding the Second Amendment and firearms ownership. And David, I'll hand it back to you.
Well, thank all of you for those openings. So much information, one scarcely knows where to begin to try to get in a little bit more depth before we go to the audience for questions. But I would like to, on the mental health issue first with Dr. Roselle. I heard what you said about the low number of mental health people being involved in these shootings. What motive was the Las Vegas shooter, or somebody like him, there have been many others, who didn't show any previous record of mental health issues, and so many others who just go off and kill people? What is with them if they're not mentally ill? What causes them to do that?
Well, you know, and that's, I appreciate that almost at a reflexive level, we see one of these events unfold at any scale, and we want to be able to say there was something about the person who did that that makes them different from me, unlike me. The reality comes down to the numbers. Most of the people who engage in those types of events don't have identified or plausible mental illness. There certainly are some who do. You know, there are a number of notable examples. The shooter in Aurora, Colorado, in the movie theater shooting, a profoundly ill person, yet also a person who carried out painstaking and specific tactical and strategic planning on how to undertake that attack. Despite the severity of his illness and his psychosis, he carried out a very precise and intentional attack. You know, there's the question that some of these occur in folks where they may have a psychiatric history, may even have current psychiatric issues that are unrelated to the violent behavior. There's nothing about living with bipolar or PTSD that keeps you from being a jerk. That's just, you know, that's the other side of the recovery model. There you go for. So what motivates people? It's anger. It's entitlement. I'm entitled to hurt you. I have been hurt, so I get to hurt you back, or I get to hurt someone back. Often it is personal. You know, the sheriff mentioned that so many of the people who attack schools are people who have an attachment to the school. By and large, people are going to, you know, attack and hurt someone else for a finite number of reasons. And often when it's one of these types of mass shootings, it's either a personal vendetta. Most mass shootings happen in workplace settings. It's you know, it's the performance review gone bad. It's, you know, workplace conflict. It's the, you know, unwanted termination. It's where there are grudges, or sometimes it says, I want the notoriety. I want, you know, if you won't remember me for all the good I could have given you in this world because you didn't respect me as a person, well, you'll remember me anyhow, and I'll make sure you remember me with the blood I leave behind.
And so many of them wind up killing themselves. Were they pre-suicidal when they started this?
It's a good question. You know, Sheriff, I'd be curious about, you know, your data set. There was some recent data that came out that said adult shooters, about 50% of those end in suicide. Significantly less of younger shooters seem to. We know in the Secret Service data set that most of the school shooters had a prior history of either suicidal statements, you know, with a specific plan, or suicidal behaviors. So there certainly does seem to be a significant overrepresentation of that. Sheriff, I don't know what you're...
Can you use the mic, please?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I don't really have anything, more specific. I can tell you, in the Parkland situation, Cruz did not have suicidal ideation. He had a lot of treatment, mental health treatment, but there was no suicidal ideation there, ever.
The reality, and it's a little awkward to say this on a college campus, lots of people will have homicidal thoughts that come and go fairly quickly. You get cut off on the commute to work. You're standing in line at Starbucks and the person in front of you is ordering, Tolstoy's War and Peace. There are studies of college students, and I know we have a number of college students in the room, so I say this with care, that, maybe 50 to 90% of college students have had very specific homicidal thoughts within the past year. By and large, college students are really laid-back, fun folks and are really nice to each other and everyone else. And by the way, I teach college students, so again, I'm very wary of those numbers. People will have these, they won't act on them. But one of the reasons why people may not act on them is, in addition to being fully aware of that killing people is a really bad, awful thing to do, well, what about me? I watch CSI. Someone might, get me. I don't want to go down for this crime. But if I'm suicidal, if I'm hopeless, if I feel like all my options have been cut off and there's nothing left, well, then I might as well make an impact on the way out the door.
Okay, thank you. Let's deal with the most recent shooting in Jacksonville on Saturday, was it? Sunday, Saturday. There was a lot of hand-wringing about that, and people saying, we must do something, unspoken as to what. And then Gary, Dr. Mormino, you mentioned the word gunshine state as, did you invent that? Because I saw it in the paper the other day. They're calling Florida that. But what I want to ask is, what could anyone have done to have prevented a shooting like that, if anything? Maybe the sheriff first and Dr. Rogel.
Well, sometimes just bad things are going to happen in this world, and there's only certain things that you can do, and you have to do what's reasonable and what's realistic. We don't have unlimited money, and we can't put cops every place. So that gets back to which begs a ultimate or a penultimate question about who should be armed, who shouldn't be, and how people should be able to protect themselves. Because the reality of it is that you can have all of the mental health treatment, you can have all of the behavioral threat assessment teams, you can have all of the site hardening, you can have all that out there, and it's still going to happen. So when we walk around saying that we are doing this in the name of preventing mass shootings, that's unrealistic and naive. It's going to happen again. The only question is where and when, and I'll suggest to you the most important question is the third question, and is that what have we done to mitigate it? It's going to happen. People are going to die. Where and when's the question, but has something been done to mitigate the carnage? And at the end of the day is that comes down to somebody being able to take effective action to stop it from becoming the second, third, fourth, fifth, 10th, or 12th victim, because it is going to happen. So you're not going to stop it. You can have a lot of things in place that can catch some people and catch some things, but you're not going to stop it all.
Dr. Rosell, anything you could add?
Well, I agree. We're not going to stop everyone. We're going to stop some. We're going to learn from the ones we stop, and if you think it's hard to measure these events in general, it's even more difficult to measure the ones that we've stopped. And there will be more tragic events, unfortunately, and we will learn from those as well, and feed that information back into the process, back into the behavioral assessment, and wait for the next warning sign, the next threat, and hopefully prevent the next one.
Thank you. Mr. David, you mentioned the Heller opinion, which was a landmark opinion, but in that or along with it, Justice Scalia, who is very much honored by the conservatives, said, quote, "The right is not a right to keep and carry any weapon whatsoever in any manner whatsoever and for whatever purpose whatsoever," end quote. So wouldn't that apply to some of the things that gun control advocates want, such as open carry, guns in public buildings, age restrictions, and bump stock, banning all of those?
Yes, Scalia's opinion, yes, would apply to that. That's why I was saying, as part of the Heller opinion, there was a distinction made as well about the traditional use of firearms, and Scalia, in that opinion, did state that that yes, what you're saying, yes, there could be restrictions done, and I think depending on the makeup of the court, again, we have a very different court from even the Heller opinion today, so it really depends on the non-justices you have on the Supreme Court. I think the most effective manner would be for congressional action, or even more effective than that, that the Constitution's been amended before and can be amended again.
Well,
it would take a very, very distinct bit of effort to get that done. But I do think that if you want to get away from non-people, whichever way they're swinging, that's the most effective way.
And would it help in the legislature in Tallahassee to be doing some of this?
Yes. Scalia's opinion is very interesting because he tends to be one of the more originalist justices that we've seen in the modern era. And in an originalist opinion, the Second Amendment should actually only apply to Congress and not be incorporated. So the 50 states should actually be able, it says Congress shall make no law. It doesn't say the Florida legislature shall make no law. So under a more originalist reading of the Second Amendment or any of the amendments, if they aren't incorporated on the 14th, then yes.
Sheriff, would some of these things I mentioned have a material effect in reducing gun violence, like banning bump stocks and the automatic weapons and those kinds of things that many people would like us to do? How much effect would that have?
I don't know. It's hard to measure. I think that the focus needs to be on people and on individuals. When you see the numbers that were put up here, and you've got somewhere 300 million, 400 million, 500 million guns in the U.S., I don't think that realistically limiting those guns or trying to limit those guns is going to have the desired effect. I really think that we have to focus on people. I think we do need to have some common sense gun laws and common sense gun regulations. I've been very, very vocal against open carry. I think it's one of the stupidest things I've ever heard of, but that's my opinion. I also, though, do believe that the right people under the right circumstances should be able to protect themselves. I think if somebody's breaking into your home, as an example, you should be able to protect yourself. So I think there's a lot of room for common sense. When you're talking about doing things like banning bump stocks, so the Florida legislature in Senate Bill 7026, which was passed post-Parkland, did ban bump stocks in Florida. Is that going to have a dramatic effect on making us all safer? I don't think so. I don't know about you all, but prior to October 2nd of 2017, which is when Las Vegas occurred, I never even heard of a bump stock. So is that going to have a dramatic effect on reducing gun violence? I don't think it is, but I do think there are some things that we can do and that we can ensure through common sense legislation. There are some pragmatic things, but that in and of itself is not a wholesale answer to making us safe.
Okay, Dr. Marmino, you touched on it a little, and Mr. Cronenfeld did too, in talking about the Second Amendment. Why do so many gun advocates fear a tyrannical U.S. government that they need to keep their weapons to overthrow? Is that part of this whole culture?
Well, it is part of American culture. I had not read this book today. I would recommend this book, see if the public library has it. I read it in grad school in the 1970s. Bernard Bailyn, very wonkish title, The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution. Sounds catchy, doesn't it? And he devotes several chapters addressed to that question. Why would the Founding Fathers have been so obsessed? And one of the things he does is he went back and looked at what did the Founding Fathers read. He looked at their libraries, and they read a lot of history. And one of the themes that emerges whenever there was a republic before the 18th century, a tyrannical ruler squelched it. And the key term, I don't think the term has come up tonight. You might have mentioned it, a standing army. When's the last time you heard that phrase? I was teaching a World War II class this afternoon, and I posed to the class, why would the United States in 1938 have the 16th largest army in the world, smaller than that of Romania? And the answer goes back to the Second Amendment. There was this fear of a standing army in peacetime, and that what would happen is a tyrant would control the army and snuff out our liberties. And that's the key to the Second Amendment, was this, you needed a check on a tyrant.
Incredible bit of history there to enlighten us. All right, I want to give you all time to get some of your questions in. I know we won't get to all of them. Jacqueline and Sharon are on either end to bring a mic to you, so please wait for one and make it a question, please, not a comment. Jacqueline, we have a student right in front here.
All right, this is on. Hello, okay. So if it's okay, I kind of have a two-parted question. The first is for Dr. Roselle. There's new research from the University of Glasgow saying that humans have 4 basic emotions. So we have happiness, sadness, anger, and fear. Do you think that, especially in a country like America, where we have, especially young boys grow up, and we're suppressing that fear and sadness, man up, they're only left with happiness and anger? Do you think that is contributing to this violence? And then my second question in relation to that is for the sheriff. Do you think that kind of like that toxic masculinity, that culture of anger, especially in men, is related to domestic violence? And do you think domestic violence should play a part in who gets guns, gun culture, that sort of thing?
Good question. Good.
I like the sheriff's question better. So is it something about how we're raising people today? It's not going to be one single factor. It's a broad combination of issues that contribute to this. And again, for all of our concerns about mass shootings, very rare, 1% or less of the firearm homicides in our country. And again, our homicides are down 50% or more over the past 30 years. We're doing a lot of stuff right about this. We have a lot of opportunities for improvement, but we're also doing a lot of stuff right. We are pretty much near to leading the world in our firearm suicide rate. And that's driven by a lot of things, including ready access to firearms. I've been working very closely with some colleagues of mine who are licensed firearm dealers because they're very interested in taking care of their customers. They're selling firearms because they want it to protect their customers. They absolutely don't want it to harm their customers. And so, maybe a better way of saying this is, yeah, absolutely, talking about emotions is far better than stuffing them down and avoiding them. And working with gun-owning people and families to say, yeah, it's okay to sometimes say, what, this is not a good month for me to have my gun. Safety check, I should hand it off to someone else. As far as the domestic violence, we know that violence against women is a common theme and a common historical feature in people who engage in some of these types of mass violence. Hatred based on gender expression, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, religion, hate group orientation is a profoundly important factor in violence risk at every scale, and we ignore it to our own peril.
So I think from a law enforcement and an application of law and what we're doing to regulate guns with people in that area, I think we're fine. I think we do a good job of it. People who have been respondents, the people who have domestic violence injunctions against them, dating violence injunctions, stalking type injunctions, they're all prohibited from possessing firearms. If somebody's been convicted of domestic violence, it's a disqualifier, et cetera. So I think in that area, the law recognizes what the science has recognized is that those people should not possess firearms, and there are appropriate prohibitions in place.
Okay.
And
Sharon?
notably, if I may, the sheriff knows full well, the call out that is most dangerous for law enforcement professionals is domestic violence. That is the situation where they are most likely to come under fire themselves. So all the more reason to apply the highest caution we can to those scenarios.
Sharon, you have a. Here's one, Sharon.
Yes, excellent program. I have two quick questions. One, is there any data showing a correlation with fatherless homes in some of these mass shooting incidents? And two, is there any data to show that metal detectors are efficacious in protecting students as screening going into a school? Now, if you had a campus of 16 buildings, you know, who could afford 16 metal detectors, and then you'd need more or less an enforcer at the end of the detector if someone had something that was untoward. But a lot of high schools are one big building. Is there any data to show that's been used? I mean, we use it at airports.
So what I come back to with this is that when you're dealing with these people, and maybe Dr. Roselle can speak to this a little bit, is that this is a people problem. And the gun is the modality. The gun is the instrument that they chose to carry out that act. So if we think that by trying to, as an example, I'll take Parkland as an example, is that that's a sprawling campus, 45 acres, 16 buildings, et cetera. It's not feasible and not practical to have a single ingress and egress point with 2,300 students and to have magnetometers and x-ray machines and screening everybody as those kids are coming in every day and as they're leaving. It's just not practical and it's not feasible to do it. And if somebody, like the killer in Parkland, wanted to affect mass carnage, that is not going to stop him. Is that you could just as easily, and we've seen this in other places and other times, he probably could have done more damage if he had taken a U-Haul truck, because they do have a single, or they have a couple of ingress and egress points, and you got 2,300 students that are coming out of that campus at one time in the afternoon. Take a U-Haul truck, park it at the edge of the campus, rev it up to about 100 miles an hour, click it and drive, and run them over. Look, you saw that in New York City. You saw that last year up there when you had the person rent the U-Haul truck and just ran everybody over on the FDR. So, you know, those are things that are, you got to focus more on the people and stopping that kind of stuff, because stopping one instrumentality is not going to stop the carnage.
Sharon, here's a question over here.
Hi, my question is in regard to the red flag laws, and it's a two-part question. For Mr. Guattieri, I have a lot of respect for what you do. Do you think that if we had implemented the red flag laws before Parkland, you have arrested, or I don't know whether that's the right word, arrested, or used that law to get the killer and prevent that massacre? Secondly, on the teacher situation, I have had a lot of time to think about that. And again, with all the due respect, arming a teacher, one flaw in your assumption is that the teacher will stay calm, cool, and collected while all of his favorite students are dropping around dead, so that he can have the clear mind of knowing what the shooter will unload to go and catch them, aim, and shoot at the right person. So that is the problem I'm having with arming the teachers. But again, back to the red flag laws, please, and how many arrests have you made since it was implemented?
So I'll just briefly address your last point there. There's no perfect answer. Simply, there's just no perfect answer. In that situation in Parkland, you had a cop that chickened out and ran away. So it's all about here, it's the mindset. It's about having people who are ready, willing, and able. And some of them could be teachers and some of them could be cops. You hope the cops are going to do it. In that case, he was ineffective and he literally ran away. So there's no perfect solution. But if you don't try anything, you're going to get nothing. Getting to the, we call them here in Florida now as a result of Senate Bill 7026, we call them risk protection orders, RPOs. It allows us to go to the court and to get a court order to remove guns from people, even when they haven't committed crimes. And we've done, since that law took effect, is that we've done that just over 100 times in the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office. So we have 100 red flag orders or risk protection orders where we've taken guns away from people because they exhibit the right signs that indicate that there's an issue there and they shouldn't have them. So I'm a big fan of the red flag orders, of the RPOs as we call them. We have a dedicated unit that does nothing but identify those people and then serve the orders. So I think it's a very effective way of making an effort to mitigate that harm.
Yes.
Yes.
How about a question on this side?
If I may.
Sorry.
We know families or friends or peers often know warning signs and can often share that information with law enforcement professionals. It's often challenging to sort of get it into the right channel, and the red flag laws create another avenue to do that. It's not the only one, but it can be a very effective one. There was a case that our crisis team was working with very recently that began when an adult, 20-something-year-old, rolled his car with a DUI on one of our state highways, and the responding troopers decided he was a little bit too drunk and belligerent, that they'd take away his guns, give them to the mom. Well, of course, he then violently attacks mom, takes the guns, had a number of very concerning features, had made specific threats in recordings about attacking schools or preschools. But this was a situation where, you know, a law that says the family has to be the one to take that next step wouldn't have worked for us because the family was terrified, absolutely terrified of this very scary guy who, amongst his other, you know, possible indicators, had a swastika and 88 for Heil Hitler on one side of his neck and fuck the police across the other side of his neck. So he, that and a couple semi-automatic assault-style rifles, we were able to get to him well before the event, thankfully.
Okay, another question on this side.
Thank you. Our most recent shooting in Jacksonville was committed by somebody from out of state. According to the news media, he had been placed in a mental hospital at least twice. Also, in the Parkland shooting, there was the FBI was told numerous times, as was pointed out in the video that you did, that this person was a threat. My question is, what can we do to get better communication between hospitals, mental hospitals that have had these guys in there for a couple of times or more? What can we do with people that are clearly been identified as a possible shooter? There seems to be a communication breakdown in getting to law enforcement with these issues, and what can we do to strengthen that up?
Who's the question for?
The doctor or the sheriff?
Who wants to take it?
Yeah, I can start. So, first of all, and this is important, it sounds sarcastic, but it is important, don't believe everything you hear in the media, okay? Because the majority of it's not right. On that end of it, though, are there information and communication silos that need to be broken down in a better flow of communication? The answer is yes. There's always a better way to do that. And we should be constantly evaluating that and trying to make sure that nothing falls through the cracks. But I can tell you, as an example, in the Parkland situation, is that the ball was dropped a couple times, probably a couple times by the Broward Sheriff's Office and a couple times by the FBI, not passing that information along. But I'm going to suggest to you, and I feel very confident in this, it wouldn't have made any difference, and here's why. Is because based upon the information that was presented, and based upon the shooter, the ultimate shooter, Cruz's mental state at the time, the most that would have happened is somebody would have taken him into custody under the Baker Act for an involuntary examination. The majority of people, the absolute majority of people, there's only a small percentage when they go in for that involuntary examination, they get held over past 72 hours. The most they can be held is 72 hours, and most are held for 24 hours or less here in Florida. So he wouldn't have been kept. So and he was already under, and this is something that's a big misnomer, and because it's been grossly and erroneously reported by the media, is that he was under the care of mental health professionals for years, psychiatrists, he had licensed clinical social workers, et cetera. He had people come into his house for counseling sessions, seriously, multiple times a day and multiple times a week. Nothing that anybody would have done from an intervention standpoint. He was taking medication, he was under the care of a psychiatrist, he had all these mental health providers coming to his house. No subsequent intervention would have resulted in any different treatment. Absent a court order, which found him to be incompetent and committing him to the state hospital, is that the outcome wouldn't have been any different. So again, sometimes is that even with the best efforts, it can only go so far and bad things are going to happen.
Even in people living with psychiatric illness who engage in violence, the psychiatric illness itself is often not a robust risk factor. There are far more powerful risk factors. Again, the prior history of violence, recent acute stressors, substance use, traumas. There's a whole list of things that can drive violence risk over time in acute settings. And yes, psychiatric illness and active psychiatric symptoms specifically. So it's not just that I might be living with bipolar disorder, but right now my symptoms are really out of control. That's when the risk occurs. And that accounts for a small window. Now, as far as the most recent event, again, hard to know early in the news cycle. There are reports that there's court papers from 12 years ago that he'd had psychiatric treatment, that he had psychiatric treatment 12 years ago. I don't know what to do with that. And for all I know, he had treatment and he was doing just fine from a psychiatric perspective in the intervening 12 years, or he was in active treatment and last saw his psychiatrist on Friday. I don't know. But at the end of the day, as the sheriff pointed out, if you're not reaching really, really high levels of treatment, then people will be in the community. And that's okay because the vast majority of people living with illness are safe. And by the way, there's nothing in the Constitution, there's nothing in the 27 amendments that says because you are living with a psychiatric illness, we're going to throw out a bunch of your rights. Yes, rights to have access to firearms can and should be limited in certain specific circumstances. But at the end of the day, just because a person is living with a psychiatric illness alone should not be used to infringe on their constitutional rights. And that's an important thing to recognize, that the Constitution is the Constitution, and it applies. And certainly there are limits and pathways, but we don't just say, this person lives with an illness, therefore we get to discriminate against them.
Dr. Ajel, should we be institutionalizing more people? Should we invent the institutions that existed until the 80s?
God, they were awful. No.
But they didn't have people running around
they were savage.
Mass shooting.
The failure of our current mental health system, and I'm not going to stand here and say that we're doing great, we have a lot of room for improvement, is to a small degree maybe a lack of acute psychiatric beds and maybe to a small degree a lack of longer term beds. It's largely a lack of accessible and affordable outpatient treatment, assertive community treatment, supports in the community to help people do well. It's the lack of those that allow people to become profoundly
But
ill.
it sounds like what the sheriff said about the Parkland shooter, that he should have been locked up.
No, I didn't say that, and there was no basis for that. He was receiving a lot and a tremendous amount of outpatient care. He was under the care of a psychiatrist. He was under the care of licensed clinical social workers, and he was getting in school counseling. He was getting a lot of care, but in being monitored. But it never rose to the level under any criteria and any circumstances that he would have been subject to any other type of commitment. But when you talk about outpatient care, this is something. In Florida, and you talk about the problem we have, and I agree, putting people in mental health, and people have constitutional rights, and most people are fine with the level of care they're getting. But Florida ranks 50th in the United States in per capita funding on mental health. So when we are the third largest state in the country, and we rank 50th in per capita spending, no wonder. And one of the other aspects of this, and what causes a lot of this, is what are called co-occurring disorders. And co-occurring disorders are mental, behavioral health, substance abuse, etc. So we have a law in Florida that's called the Marchman Act. So if somebody's incapable of self-care because of substance abuse, et cetera, we can take them into custody. A lot of it's co-occurring disorders with mental health. How many state-funded Marchman beds do we have here in Pinellas County, the most densely populated county in the state of Florida? How many state-funded Marchman beds do we have here in Pinellas County? Zero, none, not a one.
Wow.
None. So the largest residential drug treatment center in Pinellas County is Operation PAR. Operation PAR has a whopping total of 26 residential beds, and most of them are funded for pregnant females. If you go over here to the medical examiner's office and with overdose deaths, which is all tied together because it's all, again, mental health, substance abuse, all these co-occurring disorders, majority of the people who are overdosing and either accidental or suicide, et cetera, are white males in their 40s because that's the demographic that there's the least resources out there for. So Florida's doing a poor job. Florida's doing a horrific job. So before we start talking about warehousing people or we start talking about these enhanced commitments, let's worry about some of the basics. Being the third largest state and ranking 50th in per capita funding in mental health, the largest, most densely populated county in the state has no Marchman beds. We're using the jail. And the jail's nothing but a drunk tank. We book 2,000 people a year on the Marchman Act, and as fast as they go in the front door, we push them out the front door. Those are the problems.
Okay. There's a question over here, Sharon. This gentleman's been waiting a long time. This one.
This is more of a question about the numbers. When I was looking at the slides going through here, it seemed like most of the deaths are single handguns, either by a single incident or by accident. So although the mass shootings are terrible and they're attention-getting, the bigger problem are the single events. And I agree with the sheriff saying doing nothing. If it's not working, you have to try something. But I'm wondering, by arming teachers or having that kind of a global answer to a rare mass shooting event, we're going to trade the number of lives or accidents in a slow trickle of accidents through schools and inappropriate shooting and accidental gun violence in that instance. So we're going to trade one evil for another by doing that. And again, I'm just trying to put the numbers together and how that would correlate. Is there any response to that?
Yeah, the numbers are it's a dismal calculus. You're absolutely right. And we don't have great measures. Part of that is it's really hard to measure the negative. I can give you, a short list of situations where armed teachers have misplaced guns, have negligently discharged guns. One of the common scenarios, and actually in hospital design, we talk about designing our emergency department bathrooms so they're okay for law enforcement, because if you go in to use the restroom and you drop your pants and your gun might discharge when it hits the floor too hard, right? And we've seen this happen in a number of school settings. We haven't seen deaths from that, but eventually, sooner or later, it may just happen. To measure that against the deterrence effect is really tricky. I flew in this morning. I went through the pre-check line, so I didn't have to take off my shoes. But boy, there were lots and lots of people that are taking off shoes because of something that was actually already stopped by routine security. 10 years ago, everyone's still taking off their shoes. Knowing that School A has potentially armed teachers or a school resource officer or a sheriff there may make me go to School B. Unless I'm really pissed off at School A or someone at School A, in which case I'll take my chances. Maybe I'll change my tactics a little bit. It's hard to measure deterrence, unfortunately. So it's a great question. We don't have enough data to answer it well.
Thank you, Jacqueline over here.
Thank you. I'm with the Raymond Blackledge campaign, and I was just wondering, my question is very simple, what a good first step Florida legislator could possibly pass or some sort of implementation to decrease gun violence in our state. And this is to all three of you. It's very broad, I know.
You want the politically correct answer or the true answer? The true answer is it's never going to happen because the NRA owns the Florida legislature. And that's just the true answer. And unless until something changes, it's not going to happen. So, you know, I've been involved in it for many years now, and been up in Tallahassee. I've chaired the legislative committee for the Florida Sheriff's Association for the last 5 years. Forget it. It's not going to happen. You're wasting your time because as long as the NRA controls the Florida legislature, you'll never see it. So, well, that's up to you. But as it stands now, the answer to your question directly, forget it. It won't happen.
Okay. Okay. And this may be the last question.
Thank you. So we heard tonight that access to guns in the U.S. is higher than anywhere else in the world, yet none of you really talked about reducing access to guns as part of the solution to our gun violence problem. I didn't hear that as a solution. Also, we know that anger management is effective in reducing gun violence, so I'd like to hear that addressed as well. Thank you.
Well, let me just, the first part is that I did address it about reducing access to guns. I just said it's not going to happen. And as long as the legislature has the makeup that it does, and as long as no laws will be passed, is that forget about it. It's not going to happen. So if you're talking about that way of reducing access to guns and through legislation, it will not happen in Florida as long as the NRA controls the Florida legislature, which it does, is that forget it. So you got to focus on the other things. So in the first part of the question is you don't want to hear that, but that's reality.
Well, you're looking for solutions. I think you just heard one there. It's at the voting booth. Sharon, up here, one more. This will be the final question up here.
Thank you to all of you. You all made excellent points. My husband and I are former ATF agents, so we totally understand a lot of this. But I will, one of the questions I have is, do any of you believe that you need high-powered weaponry to protect your homes or your lives? Okay. Also, because we operate those and, you know, we know all about them. So second question is also opportunity as the law enforcement officer, right? Opportunity is access to some of this weaponry. And is a gunfight even with an armed officer and a high-powered weaponry?
Well, you know the answer to that. The answer is no.
Right, but I think sometimes we need to, just like we have to distinguish between, right, these mass scenes that call a lot of attention and just a normal gunfight, whatever that is, right? It's very uneven, especially for law enforcement, especially for people at school. So, and I do think I think all these things we have to do, the background checks, all of that, I think they have addressed it. I think they're trying to do it. So I think we shouldn't feel like, I think at the end of this, we all feel a little bit like, like we have no solutions, but I think there's 100 things that can be done and we need to vote. I think one example, at least coming from Florida, we just moved to Florida, is that in Sarasota, they were gonna do open carry and they changed it. Why? Because it's a tourism kind of place, right? And if you're coming from Disney and you wanna go to the beaches, so there's money in it. I think we could really call a lot of our representatives and push on these issues. I'm not gonna say I totally agree with you with the NRA, but I think we can do some of these things.
Right, let's get to the answers.
Yeah, I'll say quickly, we actually have some good research that's just come out in the past 2 years. Not surprisingly, bigger bullets cause a lot more harm. And the difference of being shot by a 22 versus a 38 versus a 45, or something coming out of a high-powered rifle, just the physics of it are very different. And we have very good evidence that we're seeing higher mortality from the larger type of ammunition, and we know from industrial and sales records that this shift in manufacturing and sales, the market forces, have gone from the smaller weapons and frankly the cheaper weapons of the Saturday night specials of 20 years ago towards bigger, tougher, more dangerous firearms. As far as, do I feel like I need a high-powered weapon? I got to be honest. I live in a pretty cushy white-collar neighborhood. I've got a daughter who's 6 years old who could pop open a gun safe before she was potty trained. We don't need guns in our house. We don't need them. It's not safe. My neighbor, his Wi-Fi address is I'm the NRA, and he sort of teases me. Well, they're going to rob your house. I'm like, no, they're going to rob your house for the guns, dummy. But I go to the range. I know how to. I have some familiarity and some comfort with guns. But I'm comfortable in my neighborhood and frankly my privilege to live in a neighborhood like that where I don't have to worry about that. So
I'll put my professor hat down and put on my citizen hat. What strikes me about tonight's discussion is we really haven't asked the question, why do most Floridians feel like you need to have a gun today? This was not true 100 years ago, really, in terms of the sheer numbers. Why the paralysis of fear? I mean, many of you may be victims of road rage tonight, so you're going to need your gun. I mean, we need to address, I think, a national issue of what kind of society have we become, and that why are we so fearful? I'm struck by all these stand your ground cases. What would have been a fistfight over a parking space, a dispute in a movie theater, so there would have been a black eye 40 years ago, and now we have homicides. I don't know how society addresses this, but we need to have a serious conversation of what kind of world, what kind of nation, city we want to become.
David, you want to have a final word on that as a lawyer?
As a lawyer, not as a private citizen, I don't discuss my firearms ownership. But as an attorney, I think in a way that's the wrong question to be asking regarding, do you need a high-powered firearm to defend your home? Back to the context of the Second Amendment, and this is why I stress so much, the Second Amendment can be changed. It just takes you and the audience to do it. But the Second Amendment is not about having a high-power rifle to defend your home. It's about having a high-power rifle to defend your state or your town from the usurpations of a larger government. And again, thankfully, I am so thankful that we live here in the United States and that we have enjoyed the period of peace that we have. And we live in incredibly blessed times. And I'm so thankful I live here and not in other places of the world. And as was shared earlier, historically, there is reason to be concerned about the usurpation of power. So that would be my final word.
Okay, and I think that's going to do it. We're right on time. May we thank our panel? Wait. Before you leave, I think you heard some potential solutions here, and they went beyond just going to the ballot box. But I want to also thank my staff for helping put this on, and also the IT staff and all the volunteers. And I want to call attention to a couple of our upcoming programs that we'll be doing. On the 27th of September, we're going to be explaining the constitutional amendments, which are pretty complex this year. So please consider coming to that. It's on this campus. And on, what's the next one, slide? On October 4th, all the candidates for local office are invited to be in this room for pizza and politics. You can meet them one-on-one. Every local candidate has been invited. On October 8th, we're doing a program on climate health and well-being at the Midtown campus. And on October 10th, we're having the CNN analyst Bakari Sellers at our Midtown, at our All-State Center for a program on the state of democracy. And finally, in this room on October 24th, the next dinner program is on the very controversial topic of fake news which you won't want to miss. Thank you all for coming. Safe journey home.